Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second speaker event. Today, we are going to be discussing how technology can support the decarbonization of our generation of electricity. Specifically, we are looking at technology enabling a more flexible and resilient electricity grid. A great example for the necessity of such technology would be the blackouts in California during August of last year. Then, California had to institute rolling power outages to deal with an electricity deficit during a heat wave. So this led some to blame the high renewable capacity of the state. So today, we're very glad to have Devrim Celal speak to us. Devrim is the CEO of energy technology company Upside Energy. The company has a platform that manages the consumption and generation of different devices, which then enables a cleaner and greener electricity grid. So as always, feel free to drop any questions you have in the middle of the presentation, whether it's Facebook comments or YouTube comments, and I will then raise it to Devrim. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Sylvester, and thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. And just as a ground principle, I would have loved for this to be a discussion. Unfortunately, in this new world, the presenter becomes the loneliest person, and my presentation training always taught me, watch the audience. And the only way I can do that is if you post any questions as we go along, because I've got some slides. It will take me about 30 minutes to go through them, but I will emphasize some of the very sector-specific terminology at first. If there are any doubts, interrupt through your comments and questions, and I'll make sure that they're clarified before I move forward. But let's start and see how we get on. So I'm going to take a broad approach. I'm going to walk you through some of the terminology that we love. Give you a little bit of background of how we got to where we are today, explain what the energy transition is, but most important, talk about some of the implications that we're seeing, and ultimately talk about how, in my view, we can solve these challenges and discuss even if those are enough or do we need to do more at the end. But the most popular terminology in our industry is flexibility. Everyone talks about flexibility. It is not what you think. It is simply the ability to vary generation output or demand consumption or load. And in that definition of the word flexibility, unfortunately, the thermal, coal, and gas generation is good because they can fluctuate their output quite easily. Whereas the green energy, the solar and the wind, cannot. They generate when there's sun and wind, and not necessarily when we as consumers would like to consume electricity. So flexibility is our first term. The second one is frequency. Now, it's a little thing that we don't pay attention to, but all of us use electronic devices that need to be charged. If you read the fine print at the bottom of your charger, it says it operates between 50 hertz to 60 hertz. And if you're in the UK and most of the globe, it's 50 hertz with the exception of North America and some parts of Japan. And that's really what's required to run the system. You have to balance supply and demand perfectly every second of the day. Even excess generation is bad because that will create high frequency, or excess demand is bad because that would create low frequency. And when frequency deviates from where it's supposed to be, bad things happen. Sylvester talked about the outages in California last year. Some of you may remember back in 2019, August, we had a major outage in the UK, particularly in the southeast. And that was driven by some offshore wind assets going offline because of a trip that triggered some onshore gas generation to go offline. And in a matter of a minute, we had a drop in generation, unforecasted, unplanned drop of 1.2 gigawatts that led to that 50 hertz nominal generation frequency point dropping as low as below 48, close to 48.5 hertz. And that triggered naturally systems to switch themselves off. So even big power plants cannot generate electricity when the system frequency drops below certain thresholds. So frequency is very important in that context. And the final concept is inertia, tendency of an object in motion to remain in motion. So the spinning top is the perfect example. You spin it and it remains spinning and upright for as long as it's got that inertia keep moving. Or the hamster wheel. The hamster may stop, but the inertia of the wheel will keep it spinning. And this is really important for the electricity grid, because our thermal generators, they're spinning copper wires, so they create their own inertia. So when one of them trips, the remainder there can actually pick up the slack, manage the inertia until some others can come online and rebalance the system. And inertia is becoming critical, and we're going to touch on those a little bit later on. So 3 concepts from this section is flexibility, frequency, and inertia, all very closely related. If it's not clear yet, it will probably become clearer later on, but please do raise your hand if you have questions. So a little bit of background and some sort of feel-good factors here. Back in 2005, the UK grid was predominantly fossil fuel generation based. It was a lot of coal and significant amounts of gas, typically combined cycle gas turbines. Today, that's almost flipped the other way around. We have a lot more renewable, mainly offshore wind than onshore wind and solar, but also other potentially slightly more controversial, but carbon neutral generation sources like nuclear. And we've gotten to such a point now that we're using less and less and less coal, to the extent that there are significant number of days that we don't use it. So in this graph, depending on how good quality your screen is, mine is not. So I see some dark blues, they should be black. Those are coal generation, and the whites are zero coal generation. As you can see, progressively from 2013 till 2020, we've incrementally reduce our reliance on coal. And we only use it on extreme weather days when our demand goes up so high that we need to fire up the coal generation. So that's another good piece of news. But what we are seeing is incrementally the grid carbon intensity. And what we measure here is amount of CO2 generated in grams for every kilowatt hour of generation. So CO2 emitted per generation unit. It used to be 336 back in 2015. Last year, we managed to get it down to 222. Some numbers say 218. So that's pretty good going. Our target is to get to 100 grams of CO2 emitted for every kilowatt hour generated. That's a target set by Committee for Climate Change, and the target is for 2030. We now already see significant number of half hours, and we'll come back to that concept. Half hour is a trading period of electricity. We see significant number of half hours at the moment, especially during summer months, where the intensity is below 100 grams. And the future is looking pretty good. So decarbonization targets of the government, the Paris Accord, now that the US is back on board, is an influencer. Consumers, especially, I'm assuming more your generation than mine, is pushing increasingly for more sustainable generation. And finally, the causal effect of that is, as you get economies of scale, the underlying technologies are getting cheaper, so it's becoming even more easier to start adapting these. And we're moving in today's world where electricity generated, it was about 35% fossil fuel based, to by 2040, we're going to drop that closer to 10%, and if all goes well, potentially even below 10%. Now, the message from that, renewables are coming, and it seems like we're now on a trajectory that's difficult to stop that, but we still have a little bit of work left to do so we can meet our emission targets, emission reduction targets. Going into a systemic view of how these higher penetration of renewables are impacting the system. And the first impact is it's changing the way the grid operates. So when Tesla and Edison designed the modern electricity grid a little bit over 100 years ago, they designed an exceptionally centralized system where electricity got generated at a few large centers, and it got transmitted, then distributed to millions of endpoints at the edge of the grid. So unidirectional flow going from one big center to lots of small consumption points. And I think the wind turbines ignored them. I don't think they had many back then. The system we're seeing today is completely transformed. That concept, that phenomenon no longer holds. For one, generation doesn't happen in the center, it happens everywhere. Anyone with a solar panel on their roof is a generator. So it's gone from centralized transmission connected to embedded distribution connected. The implication of that is it's no longer unidirectional. Electricity can come and flow from both directions. So we've got a bidirectional system where suddenly planning and running doesn't work. We have to think of problems as real-time optimization problems and try and balance not just supply and demand, but the flow of electricity as well. A big change, old world, and for me, my reference point is 2008, not that long ago. The UK had 3,800 generation sites, and they were mostly, as we discussed, coal, gas, some hydro. And the dots are actually to scale. Today, and this is 2018 numbers, today it's up actually we have over 1 million generation sites with vast types of generation units. And in this context, I'm going to call a battery a generation unit as well. We didn't have any then, we have a lot now. Your heat pumps, which again, think of the home or a building as a thermal storage. So heat pump creates the thermal inertia in the building that becomes storage. So I can change my consumption pattern relying on that thermal inertia of the building. And suddenly that drives another complex problem. So I have to go from managing small number of sites to millions of sites when I'm trying to create that supply and demand balance of the system. And it's a global phenomenon. It's happening everywhere in the world. And we're seeing some countries who you would think follow technological developments actually leapfrogging both in terms of policy and execution and leading some of the leading edge technologies and thinking in this whole new renewable space. So the message from there, energy transition is happening, but it's making our system intermittent, distributed, significantly diverse in terms of generation assets, and decentralized. Now I'm going to go and start talking about the implications of these. And they are quite severe in some cases. But before I go in, an important slide, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. And if you have questions, please pop them in the comments and I'll try and address them at this stage. But we talked about the importance of frequency and maintaining it at 50 hertz. And I also mentioned that is really a second-by-second balancing of generation and consumption. That balancing act starts actually years in the past. And when I talk about the past, right this moment in time is delivery. An hour ago, there was gate closed. And I'll come back to these two concepts in a second. So from now, hours in the past, the balancing of the power we consume started. And that's typically a big generator, mostly renewables, signing a power purchase agreement for a new site with someone like EDF, Octopus Energy, OVO, or any other retailer. And those would be typically very long-term, 10, 15, 20-year contracts to supply them with electricity. Then, as we get into closer to real time, we'll have our season ahead, where there will be some futures contracts exchange for more power, month ahead, and it will move us into the horizon that I'm going to focus on this presentation, the day ahead to real-time balancing of electricity. Day ahead is literally what it says, 24 hours before gate close. It's an auction that happens across Europe because we have a coupled system where electricity generators and retailers will go and sell and buy electricity in an auction. Then about 4 hours before gate close, the intraday, or also known as spot market start. And in the spot market, we look at closing that final gaps that we have in our supply or generation portfolio. These are true marketplaces. So we are transacting in the market where there's liquidity with each other using the market mechanism. An hour before the delivery, before the lights go on, there's what we call the gate close. So at that point, National Grid, which is the system operator in the UK, says to all participants, stop. I'm taking over from this point on. Everyone tell me what your position is. Are you long or short for your electricity? Do you have too much or too little? And also tell me at what price will you generate more or less or consume more or less? So based on that data, National Grid sees if the system overall is long or short. And based on that, it will look at the offers it received, and it will create a stacking from the cheapest to most expensive to fulfill that shortfall or oversupply of electricity. And that, by the time it gets to as many it needs, that says 100 megawatt hours, by the time it gets to 100 megawatt hours, it says, okay, this is a coal generation, it's expensive, so I'm setting the system price at £100 per megawatt hour. And that becomes the final clearing mechanism for us to move into real-time delivery. So at that moment in time, the system should be perfectly balanced on paper. Now, we know no forecast is perfect, so renewable generation forecasts are often wrong, but also consumption forecasts will be wrong as well. So National Grid will buy another set of services known on this as balancing services, also known as ancillary services, to provide that real-time balancing of electricity. And those would be extremely fast responding systems that can either generate or consume electricity at sub-second response rates to make sure that we achieve that perfect balancing of generation and supply. Sorry, generation and consumption. I'm intentionally taking a pause there to allow you guys to drop any questions so far. Great. And the trend we're seeing, because of intermittency and uncertainty created by renewables, is that trading, balancing of electricity, is moving from those futures markets towards the real-time markets. In the past, if you think back to that 2008 time horizon, 90 plus, maybe 95% of balancing would have happened in the futures markets. But the trend we're seeing now, and it's becoming stronger and stronger, is that that's moving in the direction of real time. What I'm showing you here is the volume traded in day-ahead auctions. And if we look at February 2015 to February 2020, we observe a seasonal 8 times growth in the traded volume in that marketplace, and that is set to grow. So one thing is happening is we're having to trade and balance our positions closer to real time. One analogy I often use is in the old world is like a Texan highway, which is completely straight with no turns. And you can literally put the car on auto cruise. And I'm not talking about Tesla, good old Chevy, put it on auto cruise, close your eyes, wake up an hour later, and you're still going in a straight line. You haven't had any problems. In that world, you can hedge your positions in year ahead market and not worry about fine tuning in the real time. Whereas the new world is a bit like the French coast or Italian coast, where you have all these curvy roads where you're constantly having to shift up a gear, down, brake, and steer to keep your car on the road. And that's where these mechanisms, this day ahead and spot markets and balancing mechanisms, come increasingly more into play to make sure you're staying within your lane. The other impact of that is quite interesting. It's actually creating some really interesting pricing behavior. The 4 charts you see is day ahead prices again, 2018, 19, and 20. The vertical axis is the settlement periods, which I mentioned, if you remember, it's every half hour, so 48 settlement periods throughout the day. And then you have days of the year. Naturally, you see, especially on the 2018 diagram, the lanes of dark blue that cut across horizontally. That's the evening peak, typically between 4 to 7 p.m., and the morning peak when we wake up. And then what we see, though, going from 2018 to now, is getting lighter, but also 2020 20, we have some yellow and red, which is negative pricing. And that's become a consistent behavior in the markets where, because of subsidy regime most of the time, renewables generate at very low prices, even negative prices, because they have subsidies that they earn that put them in a positive position. So we're seeing negative prices. So people are getting paid to consume electricity. But we're seeing the opposite extreme as well. And this is a snapshot from this January for a week from 6th to the 14th, where we saw 6 times when the day ahead price exceeded £500 per megawatt hour. Now, compared to the average of being 30 to 40 pounds per megawatt hour. And on 2 occasions, it hit £1,400 per megawatt hour. I can tell you the system price, which is what National Grid calculates at the gate close, hit £4,000 per megawatt hour. So what we're seeing in this very volatile environment is that the spread between the minimum price, the lowest price, and the highest is getting wider. And that's not necessarily a horrible thing, but again, traders need new tools to manage their world in this new system. Going back to inertia. So we said inertia is driven by spinning reserve. That's what creates the inertia in the system. As we replace what we call synchronous, the spinning reserve, with non-synchronous intermittent renewables, we're increasingly taking inertia off the system. And the impact of that is we're moving into much more volatile frequency environments. And 2014 had some odd behavior because of weather conditions, but despite that, the trend that we see is significantly volatile frequency. What you're seeing here is the throughput graph of a battery providing a frequency regulation service. So those batteries providing that real-time, extremely rapid service are having to work harder and harder to maintain frequency in that 50 hertz band. And all of that culminates to create a much more expensive system to help balance that electricity. Back in 2010 to 15 periods, we were seeing about £2 per megawatt hour. But in the last 5 years, that's moved up as high as £8 per megawatt hour. So conclusions of that, intermittency is increasing, which is creating uncertainty and difficulty of real-time balancing, which is leading to the price volatility that we've observed. Non-synchronous generation, the increase of non-synchronous generation is leading to drop in inertia, which is resulting in more volatile frequency. And all of that is making balancing a bigger challenge, which is leading to more expenses for National Grid to maintain the balance. And actually, I'll move into what I think can be some of the solutions. And on that one, the main thing that I would mention, I'd like to say at this phase, a little bit of a philosophical level, is the problem that brought us today to these volatile markets, low inertia, and the resulting consequences of that is the fact that today we're still trying to manage a 100-year-old system as if nothing has changed. And we're at the early days of realizing that and bringing in technologies, both hardware and software, to help us create a much more sustainable system. But before I go into solutions, some more bad news, good bad news is we're going to get hell of a lot more renewables on this system. So we're at the moment on a trajectory to grow renewables, and this is solar, wind, both offshore and onshore, by 250% by 2050. That's good news, but also means that inertia will keep dropping. And the cause of that is we have to realize renewables don't only bring intermittency to the system. Actually, let me take a step back. We have to appreciate thermal generation for what really is. From thermal generation, we typically pay to buy active power, kilowatts that lead to kilowatt hours when this converts to energy. But what we're actually implicitly buying from them is inertia service, frequency regulation, flexibility management, as they can ramp up and down to meet the demand, and reactive power to manage the quality of the voltage quality on the grid. When we replace those with renewables, we're only replacing one of the services we buy, which is power. The rest we're dropping. So we're now moving into a world to start with new technologies to synthetically create inertia, frequency regulation, flexibility management, and reactive power. And our horizon today looks a little bit like this. In the short term, we have battery storage. And when I talk about battery storage, I'm talking about shipping containers, 40-foot shipping containers in the middle of the field, lots of them, up to 50, 60, 100 at a time, providing real-time capabilities. And batteries are brilliant things. They're digital energy. They can ramp from 0 to 100 megawatts in a matter of a few milliseconds and ramp down and create all sorts of behavior response profiles that allow them to create synthetic inertia, regulate frequency, provide flexibility by charging when we have lots of cheap electricity or even negative pricing, so you get paid to charge, and discharge when it's expensive to avoid coal plants from generating. And some of them, not all of them, can provide reactive power by generating out of phase with the grid. And today we have somewhere between 1 to 1.5 gigawatts of these large-scale systems, and we're set to move to 2.5 to 3 gigawatts over the course of the next 18 to 24 months. The second system, which I'm not in love with, but we have 4 gigawatts of, are gas engines, otherwise known as peaking plants. These sit again in the middle of the field, a bit like the batteries, waiting for extreme events. This could be price signals to generate and create a arbitrage opportunity for their owners, so they provide flexibility and reactive power. We have about 4 gigawatts of interconnectors with the continent and Ireland. That's probably going to go up to 10 gigawatts over the next decade. That's critical because it provides flexibility, but at the same time, they're all DC, and because of that, they don't provide inertia, frequency regulation, and some of the other services. In fact, they replace what we would have received otherwise. And then we move into some later stage, which is commercial industrial demand response. So sending signals to large industrial sites to shift their industrial process around. So they're not running processes during high price periods, or they're running them just before high price periods, not to run them during that high price period. The thing that's going to transform the system is electric vehicles. We believe we're actually at an inflection point now where new sales are increasingly being replaced by electric vehicles. And at the end of the day, an electric vehicle is batteries on wheels. It just needs a slightly more complex optimization to figure out when and where they're going to be and how much storage they're going to have in their batteries and charging needs. But once you've figured out the optimization problem, they become a good vector to use in balancing the grid. Residential demand response is going to be very important because a lot of the peak demand is driven by homes. It's typically behavior of people going home and switching things on. But the thing that excites me most is the one that I highlighted in red. So far in this presentation, I always talked about renewables as the root cause of some of the problems we're seeing. We believe we can actually use renewables to provide a solution as well. And as they come off subsidies, the owners of these assets are looking for alternative revenue stacks that they can tap into. And we're running trials to use wind turbines to provide flexibility. So get them to generate a little bit less, they can ramp up, or switch them off at the right time. We are actually creating frequency response. So you can change the pitch of some of the turbines to fluctuate their output. And the next project we're doing is to create inertia from wind turbines. And I think that would be quite transformational for the system. So in a beautiful way, you can use the root cause of the problem to create the solution for itself as well. And
Hi, Devrim. Sorry, just a question, from the audience. So David was actually asking, does this renewables actually allow us to kind of replace those gas picker plants? So he was basically asking, does the use of renewables make the increased use of gas engines necessary? So does this impact actually how green renewables are when we consider the whole system?
Yeah. So David, in the short term, gas engines are benefiting from this because volatile markets make very attractive arbitrage opportunities for them. The second thing that's driven gas engines was some of the earlier government subsidies. that allowed them to be built because they could tap into long-term revenue streams. And the other driver that's sort of driven them in the short term is the fact that we are decommissioning significant amount of coal generation and some CCGTs as well. So all of that were some of the drivers behind gas engines. But what I'm starting to see increasingly as storage, battery storage is getting cheaper and cheaper, and electric vehicles are actually driving that drop in that cost technology for storage because they use the same underlying tech. Some of the gas engine investors are shifting their focus towards batteries. So my hope is we'll rely less on gas engines for helping balance renewables and more on storage.
Okay, thanks.
And I think I will come back to this last point. In the medium to long term, we need even more storage to run a system on 50% plus renewables, or ideally 100% renewables. And those storage has to be much longer term. So current battery storage technologies are an hour, moving towards 2 hours in the UK. In the US, slightly different marketplace. It's 3 to 4 hours, depending on whether you're on the East or West Coast. But UK is 1 to 2 hours. And you can't balance the whole system on that horizon of storage. So my hope is hydrogen, and hydrogen using electrolyzers for run by renewable generation. So when we have excess, especially overnight wind, to store hydrogen and then use that to generate electricity when we hit peaks throughout the day. And that should give us a slightly better storage vector than current battery technologies have. And I wanted to mention carbon capture and storage. I think no matter what we do, we will need that to get to a completely carbon neutral generation system and actually net zero targets for 2050. But all of this will only work if we can create the market structures to get investors and individuals to invest in these underlying technologies. And if you go back to the history of renewables, the trigger point was subsidies. So government policy led to subsidies, and these were feed-in tariffs and contracts for difference, which allowed investment firms to invest in renewables. The government basically told them, go and build these, and no matter what happens in the markets, I will guarantee floor prices that will allow you to build your return on investment. And that rush to invest in renewables led to clean and cheaper electricity, which pushed consumer demand, which ended up in the drop in prices, especially things like solar PV panels, significant drop in prices. We're seeing the same in storage now. That led to further investment. So that was absolutely the right decision. 5 years ago, we started pushing into wind as well, and UK has become one of the leading nations in wind development. Now, as we progress, subsidies are gone. So feed-in tariffs are out. Contracts for difference, these are auctions that the government runs. Historically, in the last auction, the contract for difference, which is a floor price for generators, dropped to £39 per megawatt hour, which is typically below the market, so under the water in most times. So the renewables are sort of starting to work in what we call merchant risk environments, so they don't need subsidies. But to get this next wave of flexible technologies like storage, heat pumps, electric vehicles, hydrogen especially, we need a new mechanism. And that's where a lot of the new technological development is starting to focus. And that's a real market structure where we can use the peaks and troughs in pricing and demand to allow these assets to go in and out of these real-time markets to be able to create value for their investors. And the current trend is actually quite encouraging. That's why the storage investments went from a few small 100 megawatts about 18 months ago to 1.5 gigawatts today. And I can safely say we're pushing towards the 2.5 to 3 gigawatts over the next 18 to 24 months. But this needs a complete digitization of the underlying system. And what we really need is solutions, technology solutions that bridge these assets on the ground with all the energy markets that are out there. So linking physical part of the energy world with the financial part of it. And fortunately, there is a large group of brilliant companies who are actually forging ahead and developing these and being very successful in what they do. And the way I describe when I talk to different audiences is I see them as absolutely the conductor of the orchestra, where they're trying to harmonize cheap and green electricity with the consumption and automating that whole process, so you and I don't have to worry about when I charge my car or set my washing machine to do my laundry. All of that is perfectly automated, harmonized. So we're actively pushing for that greener electricity system. But is that enough? Apparently not. So when we look at the carbon budgets, which the Committee for Climate Change sets for the UK, we are currently on a trajectory to miss our next two, which is 2025, 2030, the fourth and the fifth budgets. And we're going to miss it by quite a big margin. And the only way we can get to that is to execute everything I've talked about. Get an intelligent digitized system, push heavily into electrifying heat and transport, but also push heavily into developing hydrogen capabilities and carbon capture and utilization and storage. But I think in reality, a lot of it is going to be around carbon capture and storage. And I'm going to take a pause there. And actually, that's the end of my material. I'm going to stop and thank you guys for inviting me, for your attention to the presentation, but now turn it over to you for your questions.
Thanks a lot, Devrim, for that very insightful talk. The information on electricity markets as well as how you leverage those markets was really useful. Yeah. So as of now, I think we'll just give a few minutes for the audience to put in any question. Yeah. But yeah, I'll just ask a few questions of my own. So I guess in one of the talk, you actually mentioned how gas picking plants, interconnectors, as well as industrial demand response is already being used by the grid. So they are kind of like more traditional forms of grid management or balancing. So in a sense, does your platform interact with such traditional assets? Or are you kind of just looking at kind of newer, decentralized renewables?
So we go across the whole portfolio. So because we are a software platform, our customers are typically big traders, and in certain cases, they would like to use these assets to create flexibility for their trading operation or arbitrage opportunities. So we are asset agnostic. We like to work on the greener end of it. So we have phased out all diesel generators in our platform as a policy. We think in the short term there's use for peaking plants, gas peaking plants. And one of the hypotheses that we're testing with some owners is how easy it may be to convert those to run on hydrogen. Because if we can achieve that, and they are in areas where there'll be a hydrogen network, then it makes sense to continue using those, generating power using hydrogen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we just have one question in from the audience. So this is by Adria. So we're just wondering, could you kind of give an update on the status of CCS technologies, as well as the projected influence of CCS in the future?
So there's a number of different technologies on CCS. Some are starting to become quite successful, where they can capture 90% plus of the carbon in systems they're working in. Their initial targets are big industrial processes, so refineries, systems where they burn to create heat, so combustion-based systems. Kilns is one, and you can imagine the rest. I don't need to go into it. What I'm observing is happening with the CCS technologies is twofold. You've got startups with great solvents that are creating very modular systems that's very easy to go and install these at different sites and can go smaller and smaller into these hard to decarbonize sectors. And that's going to be, I think, quite successful strategy for some of the startups. The other part that I'm seeing is the other end, where let's say slightly controversial, but I think necessary, is blue hydrogen. So today, the two most prominent ways of generating hydrogen is blue, where you take natural gas and you extract the hydrogen from that, and then you have a byproduct, which is carbon. you capture that, but typically you go and sink that into an old gas well somewhere in the North Sea, and you create a millennia of storage of it there. The third dimension is DAC, which is direct air capture. So it makes it the air. You don't have the solvent, or you could have the solvent in your process, but you're actually sucking out of the air. And I've seen those models trying to get more to utilize the carbon they capture in other bio-industries. But I think there's a lot of emphasis on CCS, particularly from old oil and gas companies, because they see CCS as a way of saving their stranded assets that wouldn't be able to operate because of regulatory environments.
Okay. And we have a second question from Flora. So she was asking, so previously you mentioned that hydrogen storage is actually better than current battery technology for intraday response. So one thing you mentioned was kind of shifting night wind energy to the next day. So on what basis is this comparison for intraday response?
Yeah. So Flora, thanks for that, because I may have misrepresented myself. So I think if we think of the real-time trading horizons, hydrogen is probably not your best vector for that, because it depends on how you're storing your hydrogen, but there's a ramp-up time. So you may be able to do day-ahead optimization. That's fairly easy because you would know hours ahead what the prices are going to be. But I see hydrogen storage as more longer duration storage. So because you're generating it with effectively zero marginal cost electricity, if you're doing it with wind on using electrolyzers for green hydrogen, and that allows you to store it at scale and create much longer generation to address the peaks. Now, interesting, sort of a little bit of a tangent there. It's estimated that this electrolyzers will create a 3% increase on electricity demand. But the good thing about that is that will be during low electricity usage, so it'll be green energy, and that will be used to avoid peak energy generation from carbon-intensive generation methods.
Okay. But I guess when you're talking about longer term, so we'll be looking at stuff like kind of season ahead contracts, right? So do you actually foresee?
Not probably season ahead, though. There are some experimental projects of capturing the hydrogen in salt caverns, for example, where you can store significant amounts of it. So those could provide those much longer horizon storage capabilities. But in the shorter term, I'm thinking probably a few days ahead, a week ahead kind of environments. So what I'm looking for is being able to burn that for hours at a time to curtail when there may not be any wind. So I'm trying to create a balancing mechanism for no renewable generation, which may be days at a time, but not seasons at a time.
Okay, got it. Yeah, so Daisy, a third question. So you mentioned batteries and hydrogen storage as kind of methods for responding to demand. So what do you actually think about other technologies such as liquid air pump storage?
I think liquid air is a technology that really excites me. I don't know if you followed the recent project that's by Manchester, where, and I'm embarrassed because the name of the company is escaping me now. So if anyone knows, please write it into the comments. Highview Power, which has a proprietary, very innovative and encouraging tech. It's actually not liquid air, compressed air, which I guess becomes liquid, where they're building a 50 megawatt, 250 megawatt hour storage. So that's naturally a 5-hour project. I think that's super exciting, and it would definitely have a role to play for as long as it can hit the right economies, because subsidies are gone for these. It would have to be create itself a value in the marketplace. There was a second part of the question. Pumped storage, I assume you mean pumped hydro. Not one that I'm super keen of. So UK has a sizable pumped storage portfolio, especially with Dinorwic in Wales. But pumped hydro is slightly controversial because it comes with its environmental impact. So I think I hope we'll rely more on flow stream-based hydro and less new hydro investments.
Okay. And kind of just going back a bit to the point on kind of seasonal storage. So I guess now when we are still looking at around 50% renewables, what is important is kind of like the few days, few months kind of balancing. But when we actually reach 100% renewables, that is when seasons become important, right? So in that sense, do you think the markets would be sufficient to provide that kind of seasonal balancing in a sense?
I think so. So if we are still building interconnectors aggressively, it's because there are markets that allow that. And as you build the interconnects, there's with multiple connection points, and interconnectors are becoming actually quite sophisticated now. They're becoming grids on their own. So there's a North Sea grid work being carried out to connect different offshore sites together so that you can flow the electricity from them to Nordics, to continent, or the UK. And as we're building a much more interconnected system, suddenly your vectors of optimization become much bigger than, seasonally there may not be wind or solar for a while in the UK, but it may be a completely different story on the continent or Nordics where we can tap into generation or storage on those sides. So I think we're on a good trajectory, but we have more work to be done on the technology side.
Okay. And just a related question from David. So what technologies do you think are able to store energy for longer timescales than, let's say, ours? So for example, to meet UK space heating demands in the winter.
Yeah. So raising my hat as Octopus Energy here, we push exceptionally hard for electric heating, because I think that's the way we're going to get our decarbonization targets. I think we've got a long way to go on that one. The real issue, which is what we're consciously pushing now, is it's still quite expensive. So it needs subsidies. The government has put green bonds for air source heat pumps, which I think is encouraging. And as we deploy more, we're going to go down that up the learning curve and down the technology curve to get those prices to where it's supposed to be. I think today it costs about £10,000 to fit a air source heat pump. In essence, there's nothing in an air source heat pump that we don't have in an air conditioner, split unit air conditioner today, which costs a couple of £100s. So I think doing all of that would help, but those don't really solve our long-term storage requirements. They help. They give us a vector of optimizing against, but I think we're going to need hydrogen, better use of our pumped hydro, compressed air, and anything else that's down the horizon.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And last question from Stephen. So are you convinced that government ministers are intelligent enough to understand all of this, or are you hoping that engineers would actually be put in charge?
I smile, not, please don't take it in a cynical way. I work very closely with different parts of the government. We work as a group, and it's not just Upside or Octopus. Everyone in this industry is very heavily engaged because the mission is big. I'm fairly encouraged by some of the policy decisions over the last 5 to 10 years, like big push for wind was absolutely the right thing to do. I think the big push for electrification of heat and transport is the right thing to do, was and continues to be. Some of the current policies worry me. There's talk of hydrogen being used for domestic heat. That will be a shame. That will be a massive shame, because it requires a massive undertaking to upgrade both the gas distribution network to hold hydrogen, but also you need to go and change every single boiler in the nation to be able to handle that. So we're pushing against that. So I'm giving a long-winded response to your question. I'm not trying to avoid it. I think they have all the right intentions, but we see our responsibility as industry to give them the right thinking, but also tools. So finished products to say, this is what your plan should be. If it was up to us, this is how we would do it. And we have quite a few engineers in the team who are involved in the process. So yes, I think we need more engineers involved in that. The one challenge we get with engineers, and I realize I'm talking to an audience of engineers, is over-engineering. And that's been the curse of the old system. If you look at the grid in the UK today, whether it's transmission or distribution, it's gold-plated, because it's always been designed for the utmost worst-case scenario. Not to crash, which wasn't a bad thing, because they didn't have access to flexibility, modern technologies. I think our challenge as economists, myself, and my colleagues as engineers, is to find how do we design the new system, both from a engineering perspective to work, but also from an investor perspective to actually make financial case so we can drive investment into it.
Okay. Yeah. And maybe just another more technical question from myself. So, when you talk about the solution, you mentioned kind of bridging of assets and markets, right? So, does a platform like yours actually perform the transaction directly, or are you more of like an information provider?
It does a number of things. It manages the physical control of the asset and forecasting what the asset is, well, determining what the asset is doing and what it can do. What we do not do is trade ourselves. So our customers give us their view of prices. So they say, I think, day ahead is going to be like this. This is how intraday is going to move. This is how the system price is going to move. We absorb those and determine what's the economically or sometimes environmentally the best way to utilize those assets to meet the objective function. If the customer approves that, then we take the responsibility of physically controlling those assets to deliver against that optimization. Now, in reality, this is a constant game. We play this every half hour or literally every minute at times. So prices will change, forecasts will change. When that happens, you got both physical and financial commitments, preset commitments. So with the new price view, you're having to consider those as constraints and inputs and re-optimize it as a full system.
Okay. And in terms of kind of household and consumer devices, is that still a very kind of small proportion, or is it actually quite significant? So
Today,
are we looking at larger scale, or yeah?
Yeah, today, 90%, 95%, it's very large scale. But that's changing quite rapidly. There are a few companies out there. We are one of them. OVO is another one. There are some smaller players that are pushing more demand side response, and that's coming through tariffs. So tariffs that incentivize people to be more responsible. And actually, it's not a difficult challenge. People are actually asking for these now. So it's our responsibility to present them with tariffs that enable them to realize greener and cheaper electricity. And we see this 2021 as a transitional year for that. But it'll be 2022 beyond where we're going to start seeing meaningful numbers. And when I say meaningful numbers, hundreds of thousands of electric vehicles, heat pumps, small batteries, and PVs participating in markets.
Okay. Yeah. So it seems like that's all the questions that the audience and myself have for you. So yeah, it seems like this would be a good time to end the talk. So Jess, do you have any final comments, Devrim?
I think this has been really good questions. And open forum. You guys can either have my details or you can get them from Sylvester. If you want to discuss these, have conversations about different aspects of the system, do reach out. And if I don't have the answer or can't provide the detail you want, I'll be happy to put you in touch with some of my colleagues. And I think I have either dropped off or Sylvester has dropped off. I can't tell if it's me or Sylvester. Could someone in the audience please drop a message into comments so I know if it's me? I'll restart my connection. Okay, so guys, I think it's actually we reached the end. Thank you for the notes, Stephen, and offer is there. Do reach out. I'd be happy to continue conversation.